Hi Yogi, and welcome to another Asana Lab with me, Oshana. In this episode, I am answering some of the questions that you guys sent me via my Instagram, and also a couple of you actually emailed me. Of course, as always, it's taken me quite a few months to get around to filming this, simply because my filming time is super limited at the minute. So I tend to focus on actually getting a weekly flow out to all of you rather than focusing on some of these smaller, shorter videos. But I felt like it was sort of high time that we answered some of these questions. I'm going to leave you some timestamps in the video description below in case you just want to skip ahead to a particular question. And then we will dive right in. Okay, this first question is short and sweet. It got sent in from my friend Michael. I suspect it's probably a joke question, but I am that level tedious and facetious and I'm going to answer it anyway. And he asked me, what is the best way to down the dog? Asking for a friend. This is also a dead giveaway for the fact that you are not watching my YouTube videos, Michael, because I've already covered downward facing dog in an Asana Lab video that I'm going to link here right now. And then, you just gotta do some catching up. The next question is from one of my long-standing students, and she is asking if I have any suggestions for recovery and regaining strength and flexibility. So because I know this person, I know that they are specifically asking about post-surgery recovery. And I should say, of course, if you love doing yoga and it's something you can easily convince yourself to do maybe every other day, then that's a perfect place for you to rebuild strength. But ideally, in my personal opinion, a physiotherapist or even a good personal trainer who you see semi-regularly, like maybe once a month or every 3 months, will usually get you faster results that are more targeted to what you specifically need in that recovery. In terms of yoga, especially group classes and these classes on YouTube tend to be more general. I think if you're going to use yoga to rebuild that strength, then you want to ideally focus on the balancing postures, because realistically, in order to have good balance, you do have to have those muscles and that strength to support you there. And it's not a bad thing to work on. Most of us actually really need good balance throughout our day-to-day lives. It stops us from tripping over and landing flat on our face. So it's a useful tool to have. And flexibility, I'm going to talk a little bit more about in the next question. But I also want to mention, as part of this, my experience with surgery personally is fairly limited. I've only really had one surgery that was really, really minor. But what I can say just from that experience is that really there's almost a sense that you become disconnected from your body when you go through that process. I mean, there's a literal cut that happens to your body, and I find that that cut is also to some degree mental. And I think yoga really is a place to rebuild your connection and your trust in your body more than anything else. So I think healing more the mental, psychological wound of not just surgery, but also dealing with being in hospital and also chronic illness. I think yoga is more that space for rebuilding the connection to yourself, and I think that's a much more helpful tool that yoga has to offer when you're recovering from any kind of physical trauma or even mental trauma. So that's my kind of 2 cents to that question. Okay, the next question is, how do I become more flexible? Mobility tips, please. 3 exclamation points. So it's very important, apparently. And this came from a weightlifter. So I'm sort of gearing it specifically to weightlifters, but this is my general opinion. I would first and foremost say that personally, I tend to separate flexibility and mobility. I would say flexibility refers more to passive range of motion, and mobility to me is more related to active range of motion, sort of how far can you go into a movement, into a pose, and still support yourself there in a way that would allow you to actually just engage your muscles to get out. So if we take, for example, lifting your leg, if you're standing upright, if you grab hold of your big toe, how high can you lift your leg using your arm? That would be your passive range of motion. And then if you let go of your foot with your hand, how high can you hold that leg just using your muscles? That would be your active range of motion. People tend to prioritize passive range of motion over active too much. I think active is actually more valuable to us in our day-to-day life, even though it's probably less fun to work on. But then, is flexibility ever fun to work on if you're not already hypermobile? That's a good question for the yoga teachers amongst you. In terms of actually improving mobility, I would say probably the most baffling thing about weightlifters is that they understand perfectly how to build and strengthen muscle, and yet they do not apply those rules to their mobility work. When you are lifting weights to build muscle, you're doing those exercises for a specific number of sets, and you're doing a specific number of repetitions within those sets. And you kind of have to ask yourself if you're doing that same kind of programming for your mobility work, and also are you maintaining the same level of consistency and the same level of actual hours that you're putting into contracting your muscles to stretching them, right? Because actually there is a relationship between those two things. You get out of something what you put into it. Like, you should understand that from weightlifting. And I get that the mobility work doesn't seem as exciting as the actual lifting, but if you want those improvements in your lifts, or if you're a regular person, non-weightlifting specific, if you want to see an improvement in your mobility, then you actually do have to put that time in. And you can think to yourself, okay, I'm going to, for 3 months, really focus on my shoulder mobility and just do exercises for that. Or I'm going to spend 3 months really focusing on my spine or hips, etc. And you will see those changes if you're doing the same exercises. Maybe you just pick sort of 5 or 6 things that you do every single day and you kind of stick to it, because muscles love consistency and repetition. That is really the key to building and maintaining and lengthening them. So that's my sort of 2 cents on that. It does become a little bit more complicated when you are looking for mobility within a joint. So let's say, for example, if we go back to weightlifting, ankle mobility is much more complicated because there's, the potential for you to be working against bone, and realistically, we can't do anything about your bone structure. So those areas where there's, a knee joint, an ankle joint, a hip joint, etc., gets a little bit more tricky because not all of that mobility is just down to hard work. This next question came in the form of quite a long email, so I'm just going to paraphrase and say that this person essentially was having some fairly out there experiences in their meditation practice and was asking me for my guidance as a teacher in terms of navigating this. And it's probably also worth adding that they are on an entirely different continent to me. And this is a sort of situation where realistically, I think, you can get a lot out of YouTube tutorials and YouTube classes. There's a wonderful community of yogis here that are really putting out amazing content. And I'm not really necessarily talking about myself. And, you can, in that way, build up a really consistent and really advanced home practice, which is a wonderful thing. But I think at a certain point, you do want to be present in person with a teacher who can kind of guide you in the right direction. And this is certainly one of those times when I would suggest that really you need somebody who is local to where you are, who you can go and talk to. As the head of my lineage, Yogi Raj Alan Finger will often say, Even Hitler meditated. So realistically, just because you meditate doesn't mean you're on the right path. You can easily get derailed and sort of go down the wrong track. And it's very hard for people who don't meditate regularly to understand how people can have a psychotic break in meditation practice. But it does happen, and people end up in psychiatric hospitals even. So it can get quite serious quite quickly for some, with certain conditions that might already have been there before they ever started practicing. And so it's really helpful to have someone who is well informed and who has a good understanding of the practice from maybe several decades of their own experience, where they can kind of guide you in the right direction. And if there's anything going on that might be needing more assistance from a psychotherapist or psychologist, then they can also kind of refer you to somebody who is, again, near you. So I just thought I would also, on top of replying to that person personally, I thought I'd also mention it here, because I think, if you're on YouTube watching this, there's a good chance you might eventually get to that point. And of course, you can always get in touch with me, and I will try to put you in touch with someone who is near you, if that's what you're looking for. Certainly within my lineage, we're quite international and well connected, so you might be able to find someone who's an ISHTA yogi near you. Okay, final question. This person's asking, what do you mean by new school moves versus old school yoga? So that's specifically referring to my Instagram biography, where I wrote that I teach new school moves while respecting old school yoga. And for me, that distinction is really about the fact that I don't feel super attached to the physical part of yoga practice, because a lot of the postures that we think are traditional are not as traditional as we believe them to be. So, for example, most people will really believe that something is not a proper yoga class unless you've got your warrior 1, your warrior 2, and a bunch of vinyasas in there. And all of those postures at best are about 100 years old, when the whole of yoga is somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 years old. So, it's very strange to me that people get so hung up on certain poses which they believe to be, the essence of yoga, and feeling the need to also do those postures in the exact specific way that some of the traditional teachers taught them. I think if we can improve on the physical part of yoga practice, because we live in a different age. We know more about anatomy. We know more about how the body moves, and how does it move well, and how do we prevent injuries. And if that knowledge can inform our physical yoga practice, if that means changing some of the traditional postures slightly in order to accommodate that knowledge, then I think we should be allowed to do that as yoga teachers. And I think as students, we can definitely afford to be less attached to doing yoga postures a certain way, right? I think, especially once you know that the yoga postures are not actually as traditional as you thought, that gives you kind of the freedom to say, actually, I feel that this posture feels better in my body if I do it this way, if I slightly change how my foot is positioned, etc. You can have that freedom to play around and sort of feel out what works best for you in the body that you've got, with whatever limitations you're working with, because all of us have different limitations, right? We're not built as perfect humans. So the idea that I'm teaching new school moves really just refers to the actual movements themselves, and this idea of respecting old school yoga to me is about respecting, honouring and teaching the other 7 limbs of yoga practice, because really yoga is the 8-fold path. There's 8 different aspects to yoga as a whole. It's not just the physical part of the practice. And the other stuff maybe seems less glamorous. It's probably going to get less likes on Instagram if I post myself meditating than if I did a handstand. That's a given. But, you know, in my personal life, the meditation practice is a lot more beneficial than the handstand. So, of course, even if I get some kickback or some rebellion from my in-person students, I'm still going to make them do breath work before every single practice, and I'm probably going to still include some philosophy in every single class. I'm still probably going to talk about the yamas, the niyamas, and close with a meditation where we cover dharana, dhyana, withdrawal of the senses. So yeah, that's kind of how I try to navigate being not just a modern yoga teacher, but also being, you know, a super white yoga teacher, which inevitably has some challenges if you're trying to actually honor the practice rather than just appropriating. And I'm not really saying that I get that line right all the time. It's really something that I'm still trying to work out, to be honest. And it's a constant re-navigating of how I teach and what I teach. And that's it. That's our final question. So if there's anything that you're curious about that I didn't answer here, then drop me a comment down below and I will happily respond to you. If you like the video, do give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Spread the good word amongst your yogi friends or soon to be yogi friends. And hopefully I will see you back here on the channel very soon for another Asana Lab or Yoga Flow. And if you want to find me anywhere else in the meantime, all of my social media links are down in the video description below. Bye, Yogi.